silence in that carpeted hallway was heavier than any shout could have been. I stood there, feeling the weight of a wedding gift envelope in my hand, while my son, Harrison, adjusted his silk tie without looking me in the eye. He told me that we were no longer his parents. He said it with a clinical coldness, as if he were delivering a corporate termination notice rather than shattering 30 years of shared history. Beside him, Victoria stood like a statue of ice, her eyes scanning my wife Alice's modest dress with a look of visible revulsion. She didn't see a mother-in-law, she saw a social liability. In that moment, the iron gates of the estate felt less like a boundary and more like a cage. We had driven 10 hours, Alice packing sandwiches in the car to save money, her heart full of a simple joy that was currently being torn apart. Harrison gestured to a security guard, a silent signal that our presence was an error to be corrected. Victoria took the envelope from Alice's trembling hand, glanced at the grocery store card inside, and ripped it in half. She said this was a day for people of standing, not for those who brought the scent of the mundane into a world of prestige. We were escorted out before the first violin played. As the gravel crunched beneath our old car's tires, Alice wept quietly. She wondered where we had failed. I didn't answer her yet, but my mind was already moving. I was no longer just a father. I was a man returning to a role I had abandoned for the sake of a quiet life. For decades, I had allowed Harrison to believe we were simple people living on a pension. I wanted him to build a life on his own merit, not on the shadow of the Blackwood name. But as I opened my laptop in a roadside diner, the digital ghosts of my past began to flicker to life. I wasn't just a retiree. I was the silent majority shareholder of the very holding company that owned Harrison's firm and the penthouse he called home. I began my investigation with the precision of the federal inspector I used to be. I didn't seek revenge. I sought the truth behind my son's sudden transformation. It didn't take long to find the rot. Victoria wasn't just a socialite, she was a predator. Through a series of shell companies and offshore accounts, she was systematically siphoning assets from Harrison's business, positioning him to take the fall for a massive financial discrepancy she had engineered. She had isolated him from us, not because we were poor, but because she knew my eyes would see through her charade. She had fed him a narrative of our inadequacy to ensure he wouldn't turn to us when the walls began to close in. I watched through the data, seeing her meet with a rival developer, a man who intended to dismantle Harrison's legacy for pennies. I spent 3 weeks in the shadows, gathering every ledger, every recorded conversation, and every forged signature. I bought his company's debt through an anonymous trust, becoming his sole creditor overnight. I wasn't doing it to crush him, but to catch him when the inevitable collapse arrived. The opportunity for the revelation came at the annual Founders Gala, an event where Victoria intended to finalize her betrayal. Alice didn't want to go, but I told her it was time to wear the pearls I had kept in the safe for 20 years. We arrived not as the rejected parents, but as the primary benefactors of the evening. When we entered the ballroom, the air seemed to thin. Harrison saw me and stepped forward, his face a mask of anger, ready to demand our removal once more. But before he could speak, the master of ceremonies announced my name, not as a guest, but as the man who had funded the very foundation everyone was there to celebrate.
I walked to the stage with a steady pulse. I looked at the crowd, seeing Victoria's face turn from confusion to a pale, sickly realization. I spoke about the importance of roots and the danger of building a house on the sand of arrogance. I didn't name names, but I handed a single folder to the lead investigator of the Financial Crimes Division, who was seated in the front row. Then I turned to the microphone and announced that I was releasing my son from his professional obligations, effectively nullifying the debt Victoria had used to leash him. The room went silent as the investigators approached Victoria. There was no scene, just the quiet click of reality snapping into place. She was led away, her composure finally shattered, leaving Harrison standing alone in the center of a room that suddenly felt far too large. He looked at me, and for the first time in years, he didn't see a burden. He saw the man he never bothered to truly know. We didn't stay for the applause or the apologies that were sure to follow from the social climbers. I took Alice's hand and walked out into the cool night air. The next morning, Harrison was sitting on our porch before the sun had fully cleared the trees. He looked broken, stripped of the false identity he had traded his soul for. He didn't ask for money, and he didn't ask for a place in the company. He just sat there and asked why I hadn't told him. I sat down beside him, the same way I had when he was a boy who had fallen off his bike. I told him that wealth is a tool, but character is the hand that moves it. I had hidden the truth to see what kind of man he would become when he thought no one was watching. He had failed the test, but the lesson was finally complete. We sat in silence for a long time, watching the mist rise off the fields. There was no grand celebration of his return, only the somber understanding that trust is much harder to rebuild than a financial empire. But as Alice brought out a third cup of coffee, her eyes no longer red from crying, I knew the foundation was finally solid. We were no longer a family defined by what we lacked or what we hid, but by the quiet, difficult truth of who we were.